All right, deep divers. Buckle up. We're diving into a question that's got everyone buzzing.
Oh, yeah.
Can India really keep playing all sides in this crazy world?
Yeah.
You know, with the whole Russia-China thing getting even tighter
Yeah.
and the West looking for some clear commitments.
Yeah.
It's getting spicy. Our listener is super curious about how India's going to pull this off, especially with all the reports and analyses out there, painting some pretty different pictures.
That's a tricky situation, no doubt.
Yeah.
India's been rocking this strategic autonomy thing for ages, trying to be everyone's friend.
Yeah, like that friend who manages to stay cool with all the different cliques in school, right?
Yeah.
But this isn't high school anymore.
Right.
The stakes are way higher. You sent over some fascinating stuff,
Yeah.
reports from the diplomat, think tanks, even some economic forecasts. What struck me is how much harder this balancing act is getting for India.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Take Russia, for instance.
Okay.
They're leaning more and more on China becoming almost dependent. That's got to make India nervous, especially if they're hoping to use that relationship as leverage on the world stage.
It's like trying to play two friends off each other, and then suddenly they become best buds.
Right.
Not exactly ideal for the middleman.
Nope.
And speaking of friends, the West isn't thrilled with this whole neutrality thing either.
Yeah.
They're starting to see it as India tacitly siding with Russia, which could really hurt their partnerships.
For sure.
And those are crucial for India's growth.
Right, because those partnerships aren't just about warm fuzzies.
Right.
They're about access to technology, investment, markets.
Yeah.
Things India desperately needs to keep its economy booming.
And speaking of booming, India's economic growth has been pretty impressive, right?
Yeah.
But then you look closer and you see massive poverty, infrastructure gaps, and a whole bunch of other challenges.
It's a classic tale of two Indias. On the one hand, you've got this tech-savvy, ambitious powerhouse.
Okay.
On the other, you've got millions struggling to make ends meet.
So it's like they're running a marathon with one leg in a cast.
Yeah.
They need to sprint to keep up with the global economy, but they've got these internal issues holding them back.
Exactly. And those internal issues are starting to spill over onto the international stage.
Oh.
We've got reports from human rights organizations raising some serious concerns about what's happening within India's borders.
Yeah, I saw that too.
Yeah.
It's definitely not the kind of press you want when you're trying to present yourself as a global leader.
And it raises a big question.
Yeah.
Can India really claim that mantle if they're facing criticism and scrutiny on the human rights front? It's definitely something the West is paying attention to.
Right.
And it could impact those crucial partnerships we talked about.
Okay, so we've got geopolitical juggling acts, economic tightropes, and now this whole human rights dilemma.
Yeah.
It sounds like India's in a pretty tough spot.
It's complex, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But it's not all doom and gloom.
Okay.
There are glimmers of hope in the research, particularly when it comes to India's efforts to work with Europe.
Oh, yeah. I was going to bring that up. There's a lot of talk about collaborations in renewable energy and tech.
Right.
Those seem like pretty promising avenues, right?
They are.
Yeah.
India has incredible potential in those areas. But, and here's the catch, their success might hinge on how they play their cards in this whole geopolitical game.
So basically, if they want to win big on the tech and green energy front,
Right.
they need to figure out this whole Russia-China-West triangle first.
Pretty much.
Okay.
And like we said, there are no easy answers.
Yeah.
It's a high-stakes game with no clear winners.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's like they're trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while riding a unicycle on a tightrope. No wonder our listener wanted us to break this down.
It's a fascinating puzzle for sure. And it gets even more complicated when you factor in the rise of authoritarianism around the world.
Okay, wait, hold up. Authoritarianism. How does that fit into India's balancing act?
Well, think about it. You've got this global tug of war between democratic values and more, shall we say, iron-fisted approaches to governing.
Okay.
And India, while being a democracy itself, is getting pretty cozy with countries like Russia and China, which aren't exactly known for their love of free speech and human rights.
So it's like they're trying to be the cool kid who hangs out with both the jocks and the goths, but the goths are starting to, like, spray paint bad words on the principal's car.
That's a colorful analogy. But yeah, the concern is that by not taking a stronger stand against authoritarian actions, India might be sending a message that those actions are okay.
And that could embolden authoritarian regimes, making them think they can get away with even more.
Exactly. Some analysts argue that India's neutrality, especially on issues like the war in Ukraine, actually undermines the global pushback against authoritarianism. It's like giving a bully a free pass because you don't want to get involved.
But on the other hand, maybe India's just being pragmatic. Like they're thinking, hey, we got to look out for ourselves first, realpolitik and all that.
Realpolitik essentially is prioritizing your own interests above all else. And India would argue that their approach is exactly that, prioritizing their need for energy trade and regional stability. They don't want to get bogged down in ideological battles that might not benefit them directly.
It's like they're saying, look, we've got 1 billion mouths to feed, poverty to tackle, and a whole lot of catching up to do. We can't afford to be the world's moral compass.
And to be fair, there's a historical context here. India has a long tradition of non-alignment going back to the Cold War. They've always been wary of getting sucked into someone else's fight.
Right. So maybe this staying out of it strategy isn't so crazy after all. But what about the downsides? We talked about upsetting the West. What if things go sour with Russia or China?
That's the risk they're taking. If they become too reliant on those relationships, they could find themselves in a very vulnerable position if things go south.
Especially with Russia getting all chummy with China. It's like relying on two friends for a ride and then they decide to ditch you and go to a party without you.
And then there's the elephant in the room, the potential for conflict with China itself. Those border disputes are a constant source of tension, and any escalation could drag India into a conflict they might not be ready for.
Not to mention the fact that some of the stuff India is doing domestically is making waves internationally, like we talked about with the human rights issues.
Absolutely. Those concerns can have real consequences. Reduce foreign investment trade barriers, even sanctions in some cases. It's a bit of a catch-22. The more India tries to stay neutral to protect its interests, the more it risks alienating the partners who could help it achieve those very interests.
Okay, so we painted a pretty complex picture here. Geopolitical tightrope walking, economic hurdles, internal challenges spilling onto the world stage. Where does this leave India? Is their century still on track? What's the takeaway for our listener who's trying to make sense of all this?
The key takeaway is this. India's future is very much in its own hands. Whether they achieve their ambitions depends on how well they navigate these competing pressures. Can they manage their relationships with authoritarian regimes while upholding democratic values? Can they pursue their interests without alienating key partners? Can they address their internal challenges while projecting strength on the world stage?
Sounds like a lot to juggle.
It is, and it's a story that's still being written. The choices India makes in the coming years will have a huge impact, not just on their own destiny, but on the shape of the global order.
So basically, India's got a lot on their plate. But hey, that's what makes this stuff so fascinating, right?
Yeah.
If it were easy, everyone would be a geopolitical expert.
Indeed. And as with most things in international relations,
Right.
there's no simple answer.
Yeah.
No guaranteed path to success.
Which I guess is why our listener wanted to deep dive into this in the first place. They're probably thinking, if I were in charge of India.
Yes. The what would you do scenario.
Right.
Always a fun thought experiment.
Exactly. So let's put our listener in the hot seat for a second.
Okay.
If you were leading India, how would you try to balance all these competing pressures? Would you double down on strategic autonomy, even if it means risking relationships with the West? Or would you start picking sides, maybe aligning more closely with one camp or the other?
It's a question with no easy answers, and one that Indian policymakers grapple with daily. The key, I believe, lies in recognizing that India's choices are not binary. It's not about choosing between East and West, or between authoritarianism and democracy.
So you're saying there's a middle ground, a way to kind of thread the needle.
Perhaps. It might involve strategically leveraging its relationships with different powers, playing them off against each other to secure the best deals for India.
Okay.
It might also involve taking a more vocal stand on certain issues, even if it means risking some short-term backlash.
Like maybe being more outspoken about human rights abuses, even in countries they're trying to maintain good relations with.
Exactly, because in the long run, India's credibility as a global leader will depend on its ability to be seen as a champion of democratic values, not just a pragmatic player seeking its own advantage.
Okay, that's some serious food for thought. And hey, if our listener wants to explore more global happenings, maybe with a little whiskey in hand, I highly recommend checking out Mickytolife on YouTube.
Oh, yeah.
It's all about travel and, well, good spirits.
Always a good source for insights and a bit of fun.
Absolutely. All right, deep divers, that's a wrap for today. We've covered a lot of ground, but I think the big takeaway is this. India's future is anything but predetermined. The choices they make, The paths they choose will shape not only their own destiny, but the future of the world. Let's keep exploring, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.